The millionaire family laughed when the son brought a poor woman to dinner, but when they found out who she really was, everyone was speechless. Alexandra Winters stared at her phone, reading the message from her boyfriend for the 10th time. "My parents want to meet you. Dinner at the estate this Friday at 7. Her thumb hovered over the screen as anxiety coursed through her veins. After 8 months of dating Marcus Richardson, heir to the Richardson real estate empire, this moment was inevitable. As chief of pediatric surgery at Boston Children's Hospital, Alexandra had faced countless high-pressure situations, but none quite like this. She'd worked her way up from a childhood in South Chicago, earned scholarships to Harvard Medical School, and built a reputation as one of the most talented pediatric surgeons on the East Coast. Yet here she was, feeling like that uncertain little girl from the South Side again. "Dr. Winters?" Her assistant's voice snapped her back to reality. "Your 2 o'clock is ready." "Thanks, Katie." Alexandra smoothed her white coat and tucked her phone away. She'd respond to Marcus later. Right now, there was a 6-year-old with a congenital heart defect waiting for her, and that took precedence over everything else. Hours later, as Alexandra scrubbed out after a successful surgery, her thoughts drifted back to Marcus. They'd met at a hospital fundraiser where he'd made a substantial donation to the children's wing. Unlike most people who recognized his last name, Alexandra had challenged his initial donation amount, arguing that someone of his means could do better. Instead of being offended, he'd laughed and doubled it on the spot. Their relationship had developed naturally after that, built on late-night conversations, shared values, and genuine connection. Marcus had never cared that she came from a different world than his, but his family was another matter entirely. The Richardson family was old money, the kind that appeared in Boston society pages and had buildings named after them at prestigious universities. Their real estate corporation owned half of Boston's luxury developments, and their influence stretched across New England. Marcus had warned her that his family, particularly his mother Victoria, could be traditional. Alexandra knew exactly what that meant. Back in her office, Alexandra finally typed her response, "I'll be there." She added a heart emoji, then deleted it, then added it again before hitting send. Her phone rang almost immediately. "Are you sure?" Marcus asked without preamble. "We could wait. Your mother's already postponed this dinner twice with convenient last-minute conflicts," Alexandra replied, keeping her voice level. "If we wait any longer, she'll start thinking I'm avoiding her. You know none of this matters to me, right?" His voice softened. "You're the most brilliant, compassionate person I've ever met. They'll see that too." Alexandra smiled, despite her nervousness. "Your optimism is adorable. I mean it, Alex. And if they don't see it..." He paused. "Well, they'll have to deal with it, because you're not going anywhere." After they hung up, Alexandra opened her laptop and began researching. If she was going to face the Richardson family, she'd be prepared. She pulled up articles about the family's business empire, their social connections, their charitable works, or lack thereof. Knowledge was power, and Alexandra had never walked into any situation, operating room or dining room, without being thoroughly prepared. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister Maya. "Girl, tell me you're not actually going to that dinner." Maya had been skeptical of Marcus from the beginning, not because of him specifically, but because of what his world represented. "I have to," Alexandra typed back. "I can't hide forever." "You're not hiding. You're protecting yourself. Rich white people don't change, sis. Especially not old money Boston rich white people." Alexandra thought about Marcus, about how he'd spent Christmas Eve with her family in Chicago, eating her mother's gumbo and playing cards with her cousins, about how he'd never once made her feel like she didn't belong in his world. "Maybe some of them do," she replied. She spent the rest of the week preparing. She chose her outfit carefully. A classic navy sheath dress that spoke of sophistication without trying too hard. She reviewed the latest news about Richardson Real Estate's developments and acquisitions. She even practiced responses to potential passive-aggressive comments about her interesting career choice or unique background. But nothing could have fully prepared her for Friday evening, as she stood before the wrought iron gates of the Richardson estate in Brookline, her heart pounding beneath her carefully chosen dress. The ground sprawled before her, immaculately maintained gardens leading up to a mansion that looked like it belonged on a historical registry. Marcus waited for her at the top of the stone steps, handsome in a tailored suit. His face lit up when he saw her, and for a moment, all her anxiety melted away. Then the heavy wooden door opened behind him, and Victoria Richardson appeared, elegant and imposing in a way that made Alexandra's spine straighten instinctively. "You must be Alexandria," Victoria said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Alexandra," Marcus corrected immediately, but his mother had already turned to go inside, leaving them to follow. Alexandra took a deep breath and squeezed Marcus's hand. She performed emergency surgery on premature infants. She'd grown up on the South Side. She'd fought her way through institutions that hadn't always wanted her there. She could handle one dinner. But as they stepped into the mansion's grand foyer, where portraits of generations of Richardsons stared down at her with painted eyes, Alexandra couldn't shake the feeling that this evening would change everything, for better or worse. The Richardson dining room could have been pulled from the pages of Architectural Digest. A crystal chandelier cast warm light over a mahogany table that could seat 20, though only 6 places were set tonight. The silverware gleamed against crisp white linens, each piece perfectly aligned. Alexandra noted at least 3 forks at each setting, exactly the kind of old-money pretension she'd expected. "Harrison will be joining us shortly," Victoria announced, gesturing to their seats. "He's finishing up a call with our Tokyo investors." She said it casually, as if international business calls were as common as checking the weather. Marcus pulled out Alexandra's chair, then sat beside her. Across the table, his younger sister Charlotte offered a genuine smile, the first Alexandra had seen since arriving. At 24, Charlotte had her brother's warm eyes but their mother's aristocratic features. She'd recently graduated from Yale Law, following the prescribed Richardson path of prestigious degrees and carefully curated accomplishments. "So, Alexandra," Victoria began, smoothing her Hermes scarf, "Marcus tells us you work at Boston Children's?" "Yes, I'm the chief of pediatric surgery," Alexandra replied, keeping her voice steady and professional. She practiced this, rehearsed ways to own her achievements without seeming boastful. "How challenging that must be," Victoria said, in a tone that suggested challenging wasn't quite the word she wanted to use. "All those hours, all that responsibility, I imagine it leaves little time for social obligations." Before Alexandra could respond, heavy footsteps announced Harrison Richardson's arrival. Marcus's father filled the doorway, his presence commanding attention just as surely as his business deals commanded respect in Boston's real estate circles. His steel-gray hair and tailored suit projected authority, but it was his eyes, calculating and sharp, that made Alexandra understand how he'd built an empire. "Traffic on Beacon Street was absolute murder," he declared, then stopped short at the sight of Alexandra. Something flickered across his face. Surprise, certainly, but Alexandra caught other emotions too. Disappointment? Anger? They vanished quickly behind a practiced smile. "Ah, you must be Marcus's friend." "Alexandra Winters," she supplied, rising slightly to shake his hand. His grip was firm, testing. "Winters," he repeated, as if committing it to memory. "Any relation to the Winters family from Newport?" "South Chicago, actually," Alexandra said plainly, refusing to be embarrassed by her roots. An uncomfortable silence settled over the table, broken only by the soft click of the housekeeper setting down the first course. A delicate butternut squash soup that probably cost more than what Alexandra's mother used to make for a week's worth of meals. "South Chicago," Victoria echoed, her spoon pausing midway to her lips. "How interesting. And your parents, what do they do?" Marcus tensed beside her, but Alexandra maintained her composure. "My mother is a high school English teacher. My father passed away when I was young." "I'm sorry to hear that," Charlotte said softly, and Alexandra believed her sincerity. "Yes, quite unfortunate," Victoria murmured, though her tone suggested the real misfortune lay elsewhere. "It must have been difficult, growing up in such circumstances." "Mother," Marcus warned, but Alexandra touched his arm gently. "Actually, Mrs. Richardson, those circumstances taught me invaluable lessons about perseverance and determination. They're what drove me to graduate top of my class at Harvard Medical School." Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly at the mention of Harvard, the first crack in his dismissive facade. Harvard Medical, you say? Class of 2015, Alexandra replied. I believe that was the same year Richardson Real Estate acquired the Millennium Tower project. Now both of Harrison's eyebrows were up. He set down his soup spoon, studying her with renewed interest. You follow real estate development? I make it a point to understand the forces shaping our city, especially since they often directly impact healthcare accessibility. Alexandra held his gaze. The closure of the Community Health Center in Roxbury after your company's latest development had a significant effect on pediatric care in that neighborhood. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Victoria's soup spoon clattered against her bowl. Perhaps we should avoid business talk at dinner, she suggested sharply. No, no, Harrison leaned forward, his eyes glinting. Let's discuss it. You seem to have some opinions about our development strategies, Dr. Winters. Dad, Marcus started, but Alexandra squeezed his hand under the table. She hadn't come here to play it safe. I have opinions about healthcare inequality in Boston, Mr. Richardson. The fact that those intersect with real estate development is simply interesting. She used Victoria's earlier tone perfectly. Charlotte tried to suppress a smile behind her water glass. Even Marcus looked both proud and terrified. Well, Harrison said after a long moment, I can see why you've caught my son's attention. It wasn't quite approval, but it was acknowledgement. Something Alexandra hadn't expected to earn so quickly. Victoria cleared her throat. Shall we move on to the main course? We're having cocoa vin, an old family recipe. She paused, watching Alexandra carefully. You do eat French cuisine, don't you, Mother? Marcus's voice carried a warning, but Alexandra just smiled. I love French cooking. In fact, I spent a summer in Paris during my residency. The hospital where I worked was near this amazing little bistro in the 7th arrondissement, Le Petit Canard. Perhaps you know it? Victoria's lips tightened. It was a calculated risk, but Alexandra had done her research. The restaurant was a favorite of Boston's elite during their Paris trips, exclusive enough that Victoria would know it, but not so obvious as to seem like bragging. As the main course arrived, Alexandra caught Charlotte giving her an appreciative nod. 1 Richardson down, 2 to go. But as she watched Victoria whisper something to Harrison that made his expression darken, Alexandra knew the real battle was just beginning. This wasn't just about dinner. It was about Marcus's future, about legacy and tradition colliding with change. And Alexandra hadn't come this far in life to back down now. The conversation drifted through the main course like a ship navigating treacherous waters. Victoria Richardson steered it toward familiar shores, charity galas, summer homes in Martha's Vineyard, mutual acquaintances from the right social circles. Each topic felt like a carefully placed reminder of the world Alexandra hadn't grown up in. The summer benefit for Children's Hospital is coming up, Charlotte mentioned, attempting to build a bridge. Alexandra, you must be involved in the planning. Actually, Alexandra began, but Victoria cut in smoothly. Oh, you mean the one Diane Cabot is chairing? Such a lovely tradition. The Cabots have organized it for generations. Victoria dabbed her lips with her napkin. Their son Gregory is on the hospital board, isn't he? Such a distinguished young man. Marcus's fork scraped against his plate. Gregory Cabot is an insufferable trust fund kid who's never worked a day in his life. He comes from an excellent family, Victoria pressed. And he's single, Charlotte dear. Mother, please, Charlotte groaned. Can we not do this now? Harrison cleared his throat. Speaking of the hospital, Dr. Winters, I'm curious about your perspective on something. His tone was deceptively casual. Our company is considering a new development project near the medical district. Mixed use, luxury condos mainly. Some people are concerned about the impact on the neighborhood's current residents. Alexandra set down her fork, recognizing the trap. This wasn't just about real estate, it was a test. The medical district borders some of Boston's most historically black neighborhoods, she said carefully. I imagine those residents have valid concerns about gentrification. Progress is inevitable, Harrison replied. Cities evolve. Neighborhoods change. At whose expense? The words left Alexandra's mouth before she could stop them. The table fell silent. Victoria's wine glass froze halfway to her lips. I hardly think this is appropriate dinner conversation. No, let's hear what Dr. Winters has to say, Harrison insisted. His eyes locked on Alexandra. You clearly have strong opinions about how we conduct our business. Marcus shifted in his chair. Dad, this isn't. It's all right, Marcus. Alexandra straightened in her seat. Mr. Richardson, every week I treat children from those neighborhoods. Children whose families have lived there for generations. Last month, I operated on a little girl with severe asthma, exacerbated by living in substandard housing because her grandmother can't afford the rising rents in her own neighborhood. That's hardly our responsibility, Victoria interjected. Maybe not legally, Alexandra acknowledged, but when you have the power to shape entire communities, doesn't that come with some moral obligation to consider the human impact? Harrison leaned back, studying her. You're suggesting we should sacrifice profit for, what, social responsibility? I'm suggesting there might be a way to do both. Alexandra picked up her water glass, using the moment to gather her thoughts. What if you included a significant percentage of affordable housing? Partner with local community organizations, build goodwill and positive press while still maintaining profitability? The Richardson name could be associated with progress and inclusion, not just wealth. A heavy silence fell over the table. Charlotte was looking at Alexandra with newfound respect. Marcus had reached for her hand under the table, squeezing it supportively. Well, Harrison said finally, that's certainly an innovative perspective. Innovative isn't always better, Victoria cut in sharply. Some traditions exist for a reason. Some boundaries shouldn't be crossed. Her eyes flicked meaningfully between Marcus and Alexandra. Mother, Marcus's voice carried a warning edge. Choose your next words very carefully. Oh, please. Victoria set down her wine glass hard enough to slosh the liquid. Are we really going to pretend this is about real estate? Your father and I have indulged this relationship, hoping you'd come to your senses. But clearly, it's time for some honesty. Victoria, Harrison cautioned, but she waved him off. No, Harrison, they need to understand. Marcus, darling, you have responsibilities, a legacy to uphold. The Richardson name means something in this city, and while Dr. Winters seems accomplished, surely you must see that she doesn't fit into our world. The room crackled with tension. Alexandra felt her chest tighten, but kept her face carefully neutral. She'd heard worse, survived worse. Our world. Marcus's laugh was bitter. You mean the carefully curated bubble you've built? The same one that's suffocating this family with its outdated prejudices? Marcus, his father's voice carried a warning. No, Dad. We're having honesty hour, remember? Marcus stood, his chair scraping back. You want to talk about the Richardson legacy? Let's talk about how that legacy was built. How many families were displaced by Richardson Real Estate's early projects? How many neighborhoods were redeveloped without any concern for the communities that lived there? Victoria's face had gone pale. That's ancient history. Is it? Marcus challenged. Because it sounds like the same story Alexandra just told about that little girl with asthma. Different decade, same disregard for human cost. Alexandra reached for his arm. Marcus, maybe we should. The difference, Victoria interrupted, her voice ice-cold, is that those decisions built this family's fortune, the same fortune you've never hesitated to benefit from, Marcus. The words hung in the air like smoke. Charlotte looked between her brother and parents, tears gathering in her eyes. Harrison sat stone-faced, his expression unreadable. Alexandra stood slowly, placing her napkin beside her plate. I think it's time for me to leave. Alexandra, no, Marcus protested, but she touched his cheek gently. Yes, your mother's right about one thing. We do need honesty. And honestly, this isn't just about me. This is about your family confronting some hard truths, and that needs to happen without me here. She turned to Victoria and Harrison. Thank you for dinner. Despite everything, I'm glad we finally met. It's helped clarify things. She managed a small smile. Charlotte, it was lovely to meet you. As Alexandra walked toward the door, her heels clicking against the hardwood floors, she held her head high. Behind her, she could hear Marcus arguing with his parents. Charlotte's softer voice trying to mediate. But Alexandra didn't look back. She'd faced enough prejudice in her life to know when to fight and when to walk away. The question now was whether her relationship with Marcus could survive his family's opposition, and whether their love was strong enough to bridge the chasm between their worlds. The drive back to her Beacon Hill apartment was a blur. Alexandra's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white, but she refused to let the tears fall. Not yet. Not until she was safely behind closed doors, away from the world that had just reminded her, yet again, of how some people would always see her. Her phone buzzed repeatedly with messages from Marcus, but she couldn't look at them now. She needed space to think, to breathe, to process the evening's events without his well-meaning attempts to make things right. As she pulled into her parking spot, her phone rang again, this time displaying her sister Maya's face. Alexandra answered on speaker as she gathered her things. "Well?" Maya's voice filled the car. "How bad was it?" Alexandra let out a long breath. "Remember that time in med school when I had to present at the conference, and that old professor asked if I was there to serve coffee?" "Damn," Maya whispered. "That bad?" "Worse." Alexandra stepped into her building's elevator. "Because this time I actually cared what they thought." Once inside her apartment, Alexandra kicked off her heels and sank onto her couch. The city lights twinkled through her windows, lights from buildings that the Richardsons probably owned. His mother basically told him I was destroying their family legacy just by existing. "I hate that I was right about them," Maya said softly. "You know I wanted to be wrong, right?" "I know." Alexandra finally let a tear fall. "The thing is, Maya, I've never felt like I didn't belong somewhere. Not in med school, not in the OR, not anywhere. I've always known who I am and what I'm worth. But tonight..." Her phone beeped with another incoming call. "Marcus again?" "That's him?" Maya asked. "Yeah." "Are you going to answer?" Alexandra wiped her eyes. "Not tonight. I need to think." "Good girl," Maya approved. "Listen, you want me to come over? I can be there in 20 minutes with ice cream and that terrible wine you love." Before Alexandra could answer, a knock at her door made her freeze. "Hold on," she told Maya, approaching the door cautiously. Through the peephole, she saw Charlotte Richardson shifting nervously in the hallway. "Maya, I'll call you back." Alexandra ended the call and opened the door, surprised to find Marcus's sister alone and looking distressed. "I know I shouldn't be here," Charlotte said quickly, "but I couldn't. I had to." She took a shaky breath. "Can I come in?" Alexandra stepped aside, letting Charlotte enter. The younger woman looked out of place in her expensive dress, standing in Alexandra's modestly furnished living room. But there was something different about her now. Gone was the polished socialite from dinner, replaced by someone who seemed barely holding it together. "I'm so sorry," Charlotte burst out. "What happened tonight was horrible, and I'm ashamed I didn't say more to stop it." "Charlotte, you don't have to." "Yes, I do." Charlotte's voice was firm. "Because you need to understand something. After you left, Marcus, I've never seen him like that. He told them they had a choice to make: accept that he loves you and plans to marry you, or accept that they'll lose him." Alexandra sank into an armchair. "He shouldn't have done that." "Yes, he should have." Charlotte sat on the couch, leaning forward intently. "Look, my mother, she lives in this bubble where everything has to fit her perfect vision of what our family should be. And my father enables it because it's easier than fighting. But Marcus is right, their world is suffocating us." She pulled out her phone, showing Alexandra a photo. "This is my girlfriend, Rachel. We've been together for 2 years. No one in my family knows." Charlotte's laugh was bitter. "Can you imagine? I graduated top of my class at Yale. I'm working at one of the best law firms in Boston, but I can't tell my own parents who I love because she's a public school teacher from Dorchester." Alexandra studied the photo of Charlotte and a pretty woman with auburn hair, both of them beaming at the camera. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I need you to understand what you and Marcus mean to people like me. You're breaking down walls that need to be broken. And..." Charlotte hesitated. "I need you to not give up on my brother. He's nothing like them. He sees the world the way it should be, not the way our parents want it to stay." Alexandra's phone buzzed again. Another message from Marcus. Charlotte noticed and stood up. I should go, but please, just read his messages, talk to him. At the door, Charlotte turned back. You know what the worst part is? You're exactly the kind of person our parents always said they wanted Marcus to bring home. Brilliant, accomplished, compassionate. The fact that they can't see past their prejudices to recognize that, that's their loss. After Charlotte left, Alexandra finally looked at her messages. Dozens from Marcus, each more desperate than the last. The most recent simply read, I choose you. I will always choose you. Please let me prove it. Her finger hovered over the call button when another message came through, this time from an unexpected source. Harrison Richardson. Dr. Winters, I believe you and I should talk. Privately. Tomorrow, 9 a.m., my office. Alexandra stared at the message, her mind racing. Was this an olive branch, or another attempt to drive her away? Either way, she knew her response would shape not just her relationship with Marcus, but potentially the future of one of Boston's most influential families. She texted back a single word, agreed. Then she called Marcus. Because Charlotte was right. Some walls needed to be broken down, and maybe, just maybe, their love could be the wrecking ball that did it. Richardson Real Estate's headquarters dominated the Boston skyline, its glass exterior reflecting the morning sun like a beacon of wealth and power. Alexandra adjusted her white blazer as she rode the elevator to the top floor, her conversation with Marcus from the previous night replaying in her mind. My father never requests private meetings unless he has an agenda, he had warned her. Whatever he offers, whatever he threatens, remember that I'm with you. No matter what. The elevator doors opened directly into a reception area where an immaculately dressed assistant greeted her. Dr. Winters? Mr. Richardson is expecting you. Harrison's corner office offered a panoramic view of the city he'd helped build. He stood at the window, hands clasped behind his back, but turned when Alexandra entered. Dr. Winters, thank you for coming. He gestured to a leather chair across from his desk. Coffee? No, thank you. Alexandra sat, back straight, meeting his gaze directly. She wouldn't let him see her nervousness. Harrison settled into his chair, studying her with the same calculating look from dinner. I've spent the morning reading about you, Dr. Winters. Your academic achievements, your surgical innovations, the pediatric outreach program you established in underserved communities. He paused. Quite impressive. I sense there's a but coming, Mr. Richardson. A slight smile crossed his face. Direct. I appreciate that. He opened a folder on his desk. Tell me, what's your current salary at Boston Children's? Alexandra's eyebrows rose. I don't see how that's relevant. Humor me. She named the figure, substantial by most standards, but probably what the Richardsons spent on weekly maintenance of their estate. Harrison nodded. Writing something on a piece of paper? I'm prepared to offer you 5 times that amount. Alexandra's heart skipped a beat, but her voice remained steady. In exchange for? Ending your relationship with my son. Harrison slid the paper across the desk. Plus a guaranteed position at any hospital of your choice. I have connections across the country. A fresh start, away from Boston. Alexandra didn't touch the paper. You really think I can be bought? Everyone has a price, Dr. Winters. I'm simply trying to find yours. He leaned forward. You're an intelligent woman. You must see that your relationship with Marcus can only end one way. Why drag out the inevitable? The inevitable? Alexandra's laugh was sharp. You mean the inevitability that people like you will always see me as somehow less worthy because of my skin color? My background? This isn't about race, Harrison said smoothly. It's about preserving a legacy. It's about both, and you know it. Alexandra stood, walking to the window. Below, Boston spread out before her. The same city where she saved children's lives while Harrison's company displaced their families. You know what I see when I look down there? I see 2 Bostons. The one you've built for the wealthy, and the one where everyone else struggles to survive. Marcus sees it too. That's why he's different from you. Marcus is young, idealistic. He doesn't understand. He understands perfectly. Alexandra turned back to face him. He understands that the world is changing, that the power structures you've built can't last forever. That love, real love, doesn't care about preserving outdated legacies. Harrison's jaw tightened. And you think you love him enough to watch him lose everything? His inheritance, his position in society, his family's respect? I love him enough to let him make his own choices. Alexandra moved back to the desk and picked up the check, tearing it in half. And I respect myself enough to know my worth isn't determined by your approval. She dropped the torn check on his desk. Now let me make you a counteroffer. Take the proposal I made at dinner seriously. Let Richardson Real Estate become a force for positive change in this city. Show Marcus that his father can learn and grow. That's how you preserve a legacy worth having. Harrison stood slowly. You're either very brave or very foolish, Dr. Winters. I'm neither. I'm just a woman who's fought for everything she has, standing in front of a man who's never had to fight for anything. She headed for the door, then paused. You know what the real difference is between us, Mr. Richardson? I save lives for a living. You just collect rent. As she reached for the handle, his voice stopped her. The development project we discussed at dinner, the one near the medical district. Alexandra turned back. Harrison's expression had changed, showing something she hadn't seen before, uncertainty. Perhaps, he said slowly, we could discuss your ideas about community partnerships. Strictly as a business proposition, of course. A small smile touched Alexandra's lips. Of course. She opened the door, then added, I'm free for lunch next week. If you're interested in preserving your legacy the right way. In the elevator, Alexandra finally let out the breath she'd been holding. She pulled out her phone to find messages from both Marcus and Charlotte. Marcus, how did it go? Are you okay? Charlotte, whatever he offered, remember, you're changing things just by being you. Alexandra smiled, typing back to both of them. I think I just made your father question everything he believes in. Over lunch next week, we'll see if he's ready to question more. As she walked through the lobby, Alexandra held her head high. She'd come to this meeting expecting to fight for her relationship with Marcus. Instead, she might have started a fight for something even bigger. The soul of a dynasty, in the future of a city. And this time, she knew she wouldn't be fighting alone. Victoria Richardson's charity luncheon was in full swing at the Four Seasons when Alexandra walked in. Every head in the room turned, conversations stuttering to a halt. She hadn't been invited, of course, but that was precisely why she needed to be there. Dr. Winters, Charlotte appeared at her side, relief evident in her voice. You got my message? Telling me your mother was using this luncheon to introduce Marcus to eligible socialites? Yes, I got it. Alexandra scanned the room, noting Victoria holding court at the center table, a stunning blonde woman seated suspiciously close to Marcus. Marcus hadn't seen her yet. He sat rigid in his chair, barely acknowledging the woman beside him who was clearly working hard to engage him in conversation. The past week since her meeting with Harrison had been tense. Marcus had moved out of the family estate, temporarily staying at the Four Seasons, 3 floors above where they now stood. That's Madison Pierce, Charlotte whispered. Old money, perfect pedigree, and totally mother's type. She squeezed Alexandra's arm. I'm so sorry about all this. I tried to talk her out of it, but it's not your fault. Alexandra squared her shoulders. Your mother wants a war? Let's give her one. She strode across the room, her heels clicking against the marble floor. The charity luncheon's supposed purpose was raising money for arts education in public schools. But Alexandra knew better. This was Victoria's power play, a public display of what she considered Marcus's proper social circle. Marcus looked up as she approached, his face breaking into a genuine smile for the first time that afternoon. Alex! He stood immediately, relief evident in his voice. I didn't know you were coming. I heard it was for a good cause, Alexandra replied smoothly, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. Arts education in underfunded schools? That's something I see the impact of firsthand in my pediatric practice. Victoria's face had gone pale, her knuckles white around her champagne glass. Alexandra, this is a private event. Is it? The invitation I saw mentioned it was open to all major hospital administrators. Alexandra smiled pleasantly. As chief of pediatric surgery, I thought I should show my support. The blonde woman, Madison, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Victoria's careful plans were unraveling in real time. Actually, Alexandra continued, pulling out her checkbook, I'd like to make a donation. She began writing, speaking as she did. You know, just last week I operated on a talented young artist from Roxbury. 13 years old, incredible gift for painting, but her school had to cut their art program due to budget constraints. The kind of program this luncheon is supposed to be supporting. She finished writing and held up the check. Several guests leaned forward, trying to see the amount. I believe this will help fund art supplies for at least 3 schools. She handed it to Victoria, whose eyes widened at the figure. I'd hate to think this event was about anything other than helping children in need. The room had gone completely silent. Victoria's carefully orchestrated social manipulation was being dismantled with surgical precision. That's very generous, Victoria managed, her voice strained. Oh, it's not just for me, Alexandra added. Your husband matched my donation. We had a very productive lunch yesterday, discussing the importance of corporate social responsibility. Didn't he mention it? Victoria's face darkened. Harrison had been unusually quiet at home lately, spending long hours at the office reviewing community impact proposals. Proposals Alexandra had helped develop. Marcus stood, taking Alexandra's hand. Mother, I think we're done here. He turned to address the room. Thank you all for coming, but if you're genuinely interested in supporting arts education, I suggest following Dr. Winner's example. Actions speak louder than social appearances. As they turned to leave, Madison Pierce suddenly spoke up. Dr. Winters? I've read about your outreach program at Boston Children's. If you're ever looking for volunteers, Alexandra smiled warmly. Stop by the hospital next week. We can always use help in the children's art therapy program. Victoria's carefully constructed social hierarchy was crumbling before her eyes. Other guests began approaching Alexandra, asking about volunteer opportunities, praising her work. The event had transformed from a matchmaking scheme into something authentic. In the lobby, Marcus pulled Alexandra close. That was incredible. But you didn't have to. Yes, I did. Alexandra touched his cheek. Your mother needs to understand she can't control you through social manipulation. And the children of Boston actually need those art programs. Charlotte joined them, grinning. Mom's up there trying to salvage the situation. But you've got half her social circle more interested in children's healthcare than country club memberships now. Speaking of healthcare, Alexandra checked her phone. I have surgery in an hour. She kissed Marcus quickly. Dinner tonight? Actually, Charlotte interrupted. I was hoping we could all have dinner. I want to introduce you both to Rachel. Properly this time. Marcus looked surprised but pleased. Really? You're ready? Charlotte nodded. Watching you two stand up to our parents, it's given me courage. If they can't accept who we love, then maybe it's time to redefine what family means. As Alexandra drove to the hospital, she thought about family. The ones we're born into, and the ones we choose. Victoria had tried to use this luncheon to demonstrate Alexandra's exclusion from their world. Instead, she'd proven that their world was the one that needed to change. Her phone buzzed with a message from Harrison. The community impact proposals look promising. Meeting with developers tomorrow. And, well done today. Victoria needed that wake-up call. Alexandra smiled. Change was coming to the Richardson family, whether Victoria was ready or not. And sometimes, the strongest families were the ones built from broken pieces of the old ones, reformed into something new and better. The private dining room at Mistral hummed with nervous energy. Charlotte sat beside Rachel, their hands clasped under the table, while Marcus and Alexandra sat across from them. The remains of their appetizers sat forgotten as Charlotte finished telling their parents about her relationship. 2 years. Victoria's voice was barely a whisper. You've been hiding this for 2 years? I wasn't hiding, Mother. I was protecting myself. Protecting Rachel. Charlotte's voice trembled but held firm. After seeing how you reacted to Alexandra, can you blame me? Harrison sat silent, staring into his whiskey glass as if it held answers. The past month since Alexandra's confrontation at the charity luncheon had changed him. The community development projects were moving forward, and he'd begun to see his empire through different eyes. But this, his daughter's revelation, seemed to have struck him speechless. Rachel, a striking woman with warm eyes and quiet confidence, spoke up. Mrs. Richardson, I love your daughter. She's the most remarkable person I've ever met. The work she does defending domestic violence survivors pro bono, the way she mentors my students when they show interest in law, these are the things that matter, not where I came from. You teach at a public school, Victoria said, as if this was a criminal offense. Yes, Rachel squared her shoulders. Inner city kids, ninth grade English. The same kind of school where Alexandra's mother taught, where students face real challenges but have incredible potential. Alexandra watched Harrison's expression shift at the mention of her mother. Since their lunch meetings began, he'd started asking questions about her background, genuinely curious about the world beyond his privileged bubble. Dad? Charlotte's voice was small, reminding Alexandra of a little girl seeking approval. Please say something. Harrison set down his glass and looked at his daughter. Really looked at her, perhaps for the first time in years. Are you happy? Charlotte's eyes filled with tears. Yes, happier than I've ever been. Then I have failed you, he said quietly. The room went still. Failed you by creating an environment where you felt you couldn't be yourself, where you had to hide your happiness. Victoria gasped. Harrison. No, Victoria. His voice grew stronger. Look at our children. Really look at them. Marcus found a brilliant, compassionate woman who challenges us to be better people. Charlotte found someone who supports her dreams and helps others. And our response? We try to force them back into the boxes we created. He turned to Rachel. What do your students think about To Kill a Mockingbird these days? Rachel blinked, surprised by the question. They find it more relevant than ever, actually. We have incredible discussions about justice, prejudice, and moral courage. Moral courage, Harrison repeated thoughtfully. Something I'm learning about rather late in life. He reached for Victoria's hand. My dear, we can fight this and lose our children, or we can grow and keep our family. Those are our only options. Victoria's lips trembled. But what will people say? They're already talking, Alexander spoke up gently. But not the way you think. Your charity luncheon? Those women now volunteer regularly at the hospital. They're seeing the real Boston, maybe for the first time. They're learning the same lesson you can learn, that embracing change doesn't diminish you. It enriches you. Marcus squeezed Alexandra's hand, pride shining in his eyes. Charlotte and Rachel leaned into each other, hope beginning to replace fear. Victoria looked around the table, at her son's quiet strength, her daughter's newfound courage, at the women they loved. Something in her carefully maintained facade cracked. I don't know how to be different, she whispered. You don't have to be different, Mother, Charlotte said softly. Just be more open, more loving, more willing to see that family can be bigger than you imagined. Start small, Alexander suggested. Come to the hospital next week. See the new art therapy program your charity luncheon helped fund. Watch what happens when we break down walls instead of building them. Harrison raised his glass to breaking down walls. As they toasted, Alexandra's phone buzzed. A text from Maya. How's it going? Do I need to come rescue you? Alexandra smiled, typing back, no rescue needed, just watching a family learn to rebuild itself. Better this time. Victoria noticed her texting. Your sister? At Alexandra's surprised look, she added, I'd like to meet her sometime, if that's all right. The request was small, hesitant, but it represented something monumental. Alexandra nodded, her throat tight with emotion. Outside, Boston's lights twinkled against the darkening sky. The city was changing, and so was one of its most powerful families. It wouldn't be easy, real change never was. But as Alexandra looked around the table, she saw something she hadn't dared hope for a month ago. The foundation of a new kind of family, built on love instead of expectations, strength instead of power, acceptance instead of fear. Marcus leaned over and whispered, Move in with me? Alexandra turned to him, surprised. What? Not to the estate, he clarified quickly. Let's find our own place, start our own traditions. Looking into his eyes, Alexandra saw their future, a future where their children would never question their worth, where family meant something broader and more beautiful than society's narrow definitions. Yes, she said simply, and felt another wall crumble. 1 year later, The Richardson estate's dining room looked markedly different. The formal portraits had been replaced with vibrant photographs: Charlotte and Rachel at their spring wedding, Marcus and Alexandra at various hospital fundraisers, and candid shots of the family at informal gatherings. Most striking was the new centerpiece, a painting of Boston skyline created by Alexandra's former patient, the young artist from Roxbury, now thriving in the restored arts program. "Maya, could you pass the potatoes?" Victoria asked, her voice warm and natural. Maya, visiting from Chicago, smiled as she handed the dish across the table. The formal dining setup had given way to a family-style arrangement, with dishes scattered between wine glasses and casual conversation. "So," Harrison addressed the table, "before we get too far into dinner, Alexandra and Marcus have an announcement?" Alexandra squeezed Marcus's hand, looking around at the faces that had become her family. Charlotte and Rachel sat close together, wedding rings catching the light. Victoria and Harrison's expressions held genuine anticipation rather than the guarded judgment of a year ago. Maya sat beside their mother, who had flown in specially for this dinner. "Well," Marcus began, "as you know, we've been working on combining Alexandra's healthcare initiatives with Richardson Real Estate's community development projects. The mixed-income housing complex near the medical district has been remarkably successful," Harrison added proudly. The project had become his personal mission, proving that profitable development could coexist with social responsibility. "It has," Alexandra agreed, "but that's not our announcement." She took a deep breath. "We're pregnant." The room erupted in joy. Victoria was the first to rise, tears in her eyes as she rushed to embrace Alexandra. The gesture would have been unthinkable a year ago. Now it felt natural, necessary. "I'm going to be a grandmother," Victoria whispered, holding Alexandra tight. "And I'm going to be an aunt," Charlotte exclaimed, practically bouncing in her seat. "Rachel, we have to start shopping for baby things immediately." Alexandra's mother wiped tears from her eyes. "My baby's having a baby," she said softly, and Maya hugged her shoulders. Harrison cleared his throat, clearly emotional. "I think this calls for a toast." He raised his glass. "To new life, new beginnings, and the family we've become." As glasses clinked, Alexandra remembered that first tense dinner, how she'd sat in this very room feeling like an outsider. Now, watching Victoria and her mother exchange knowing looks about grandmother duties, seeing Harrison discuss education reform with Rachel, hearing Charlotte and Maya play on shopping tricks together, she marveled at how far they'd come. "There's more," Marcus said, once the excitement had settled slightly. "We've been thinking about names." Alexandra nodded. "If it's a girl, we like to name her Grace Victoria Winters Richardson." Victoria's hand flew to her mouth. "Really? You've shown us that people can change, that grace is possible," Alexandra explained. "That deserves to be remembered." "And if it's a boy," Marcus continued, "Harrison James, after both grandfathers." He glanced at Alexandra's mother, who nodded tearfully, remembering her late husband James. Harrison stood abruptly, moving to the window to hide his emotion. When he turned back, his eyes were wet. "I've been thinking about legacy a lot this past year. What we leave behind, what really matters." He looked at Alexandra. "You taught me that legacy isn't about preserving the past, it's about building a better future." "Speaking of the future," Charlotte chimed in, "Rachel and I have been talking about adoption." Victoria dropped her fork. "Really? Really?" Rachel confirmed. "There are so many children who need homes, need opportunities. We want to give that to them." "Well," Victoria said, surprising everyone, "we'll need to convert the East Wing playroom for all the grandchildren." She looked around defensively as everyone stared. "What? I'm allowed to be excited about grandchildren, aren't I?" The laughter that followed was genuine, warm, healing. Later, as they moved to the living room for coffee, Alexandra stepped out onto the balcony for a moment of quiet. Marcus followed, wrapping his arms around her from behind, his hands resting protectively over her stomach. "Penny for your thoughts, Dr. Winters Richardson?" She smiled at the name. They'd married 6 months ago in a ceremony that blended their family's traditions. "I'm thinking about that little girl in the hospital, the one who painted the skyline. How one person's story can change so many others." "You changed us," he said simply. All of us. We changed each other, she corrected, turning in his arms. Your father's community initiatives, your mother's charity work actually focusing on real issues, Charlotte and Rachel's plans to adopt. Everyone chose to grow. Inside, they could hear laughter as Maya told an embarrassing story about Alexandra's med school days. Victoria's distinctive laugh rang out clearly, no longer the polite social chuckle, but genuine, unrestrained joy. Ready to go back in? Marcus asked. Alexandra looked through the window at their blended family. Different backgrounds, different races, different stories, all woven together into something new and beautiful. Yes, she said, let's go home. Because that's what this was now, home. Not just the physical space, but the people in it. A family built not on exclusion and prejudice, but on love, growth, and acceptance. A legacy worth passing on to the next generation who would never know the boundaries that once divided them. As they stepped back inside, Alexandra caught Victoria showing her mother old photos of Marcus as a baby. The two women had forged their own unexpected friendship, bound by their shared excitement about the grandchild to come. Harrison and Rachel were deep in discussion about educational reform, while Charlotte and Maya planned a joint volunteer project at the hospital. This was what change looked like. Not a single dramatic moment, but 1,000 small choices to be better, to love more openly, to build bridges instead of walls. And as Alexandra felt her baby move for the first time, right there in the midst of their transformed family, she knew that this was just the beginning of their story.